Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a good turnout. Chris Callaway is an engaging professor, and he always comes up with scintillating facts and interesting concepts, and I'm sure he'll do so tonight. This presentation is one of the presentations of the Cultural Affairs Committee of the Faculty Senate. We still have a couple left in the year. Look for notices of a French-Canadian band that's going to be playing here later this month. So if any of you are into Cajun or Acadian music, some of the best music is played right here in the state of Maine. And some of the musicians have traveled to Carnegie Hall and played there as the main French fiddlers. So keep your ears open for that. And then our final presentation of the year will be Tom Hancock talking about his experience with Seeds for Peace. And also I understand that there's a very important group coming tomorrow, and you probably have heard about that. That's 7 o'clock, is it, Frank? Right here in the auditorium. So a Palestinian-Israeli group, and I'm sure you'll all be very welcome. Chris Callaway has picked a very great topic tonight, using the Beatles, of course, imagining no religion. So please give a good welcome to Chris Callaway.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thanks to Mike for that introduction. Yes, my title is ripping off that cheesy song by John Lennon. Those of you who are old, like Dr. Connolly, will know who that is. And maybe you've heard the song. If so, I'm sorry. I find it cheesy and annoying. But it is a good title, and probably I'm not the first, nor will I be the last, to use some version of that as the title of a talk or a paper. So I was just thinking about this today. Ironically, my title is unimaginative. But what we're going to do tonight is imagine a world without religion, and my talk is based on an article that I wrote in response to having seen, a number of criticisms of religion that you may have encountered at one point or another, such as, religion is the most harmful institution that human civilization has ever produced. Maybe you've heard people say that on a blog post or in conversation. And there are variations of it, of course. Religion has caused more misery than anything else in human history. Another version, more violence has been done in the name of God than for any other reason. And of course, there are iterations of this, and sometimes it's targeted at particular religions. Usually when I've encountered it, it's been focused on religion in general. So this is what I call in my article a consequential critique of religion. That simply means it's thinking about whether something produces more good than bad. Thinking about the consequences of something and trying to evaluate it in that regard. We all do consequential analysis all the time. When you decide to get a medical procedure done, you're trying to think, is this going to make me better off or worse off? When you have to make a choice between getting expensive repairs to your car or buying a new car, you're trying to balance benefits and detriments. So these arguments, if they are arguments, are making a similar analysis of religion. Often these things, I find, are said simply as a way of ending the conversation, or they're just taken as obvious. So what I want to do tonight is think about whether they really are obvious or not. And part of why I think it's important is because of a group of people who have become known as the New Atheists. Maybe you've heard of this movement. It's a recent movement of people who identify as atheists. But what makes them New Atheists is they think that we should take the consequential critique of religion seriously, and we should start persuading people to give up religion. We should persuade people that religion is false, but even if we can't persuade them it's false, we should persuade people to stop practicing it. So the New Atheists think of religion as a kind of social hazard. There are a bunch of fairly well-known people associated with this movement. I think, from what I can tell, the lightweight is Sam Harris. He wrote The End of Faith, wrote another book called Letters to a Christian Nation, sold a lot of books. A little more respectable, from what I can tell, is Christopher Hitchens, the journalist. He wrote God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. The title pretty much tells you what the book is up to there. And some of these people are scientists. So you have Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist. He wrote a very famous book called The God Delusion. As you can see, all three of these books say that they are international or New York Times bestsellers. So they're really striking a nerve with a lot of people, and they're moving a lot of copy. So the new atheists say that we should imagine a world without religion, and we should make that world come true. We should make that world the real world. So that's what I want to do tonight, try to think about what we would have to think about if we were to imagine no religion. And it seems to me that to do that, we're going to have to answer three questions. These are going to be my main questions that we'll focus on for the most of my talk tonight. First, what are we going to evaluate? Second, what are the benefits and harms that we should consider? And then third, how do we compare the benefits and harms? And what I want to do over the course of my time tonight is take each of these questions and show how they really each lead to a whole host of other questions, many of which are going to be very difficult to answer. So get ready for a barrage of questions. So we'll start with the first one. What are we going to evaluate? Now you might think that this is an easy question, right? Duh, it's given in your title. Imagining no religion, we're going to evaluate religion. But as it happens, this question, what is a religion, is actually rather difficult to answer. Religious studies scholars, philosophers of religion, social scientists of religion, they all disagree over what should count as a religion. And there's a lot of debate about how to define religion, or whether definitions of religion are really just used to disadvantaged groups that we would like to stifle in various ways. So perhaps there's some easy examples of religion: Christianity, Hinduism, Greek mythology. But what about ideology? What about things that are more cultural? What about ancestor worship? It turns out to be very difficult just to figure out what a religion is. But let's set that question aside. Let's assume that we all pretty much know what a religion is, and that term is going to pick out things like Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, mythology, and things like that. The things that we tend to think of when we think of religion. We still have a whole bunch of difficult questions, such as this. Should we consider religion or religions? In other words, should we consider religion as a comprehensive category, or should we instead think about religions individually? Now, those earlier criticisms that I had on the screen, religion is the most destructive force known to man, et cetera, invariably, when I see that argument made in print, in a blog post or something like that, the natural response on the part of some defender of religion is to say, nuh-uh, communism was worse. It's always communism. I don't know why. But that's what they say. I've made that argument myself. It's sort of a natural reaction. And it's kind of a weak way of defending religion if you're saying, well, we're not quite as murderous as Stalin and Mao put together. That's a rather weak defense of religion, but it's making an interesting comparison. What if we ask the question, would we be better off without politics? Well, I think depending on the political system you have in mind, you could get a very different answer. So Stalinism, Maoism, Nazism, those are about as bad as they come, probably. Liberal democracy comes off looking pretty well. So if you were to ask, would we be better off without religion, we might need to know what religion we're really looking to eliminate. Just like we might need to know what political system we would be looking to eliminate, were we to think about anarchism. So if we lump all religions together in the same category, we might not be doing justice to the variation that we see in religions. A similar question is this: which version of religions should we consider? I don't mean Protestantism versus Catholicism. What I mean is this: suppose we have identified a distinct sect that we are going to evaluate. Even within the group of people who identify as belonging to that sect or denomination or faith, there's going to be a range of interpretations of what that religion is all about. Some of those are going to be more sophisticated and refined. Some of those are going to be cruder and folksier. Some are going to be more authentic expressions of what the religion is all about. Some may be less authentic. So which version of these religions should we consider? Should we consider all of them? Or should we consider the most authentic version? So think of a case, the Meletus case. This is Socrates right here. Socrates, as some of you have encountered with me, Socrates was tried for impiety, disbelieving the gods and corrupting the youth. And Meletus was one of the people who brought charges against Socrates. Now, the way Plato tells the story, Socrates thought he was doing the will of the gods. Socrates basically says, I'm God's gift to Athens. And he spent his life annoying people like Meletus by asking them difficult questions and making them look foolish. So, according to Plato's reading, I think, Meletus is really just out to get Socrates. He's just resentful of Socrates. But suppose we think of the case in this way. Suppose Meletus persecutes Socrates in the name of Athena, and in the absence of his belief in Athena, he would not persecute Socrates. So suppose Meletus sincerely believes that Athena wants him to persecute Socrates, but he's wrong. So the question is the Meletus case the fault of Athenism? I just made that word up, Athenism. Yes or no? If we say yes, then we face the question, why? Why is Meletus's mistaken and misguided interpretation of the will of Athena the fault of Athenism? And this is important because a lot of people defend religions in the face of atrocities that they've been implicated in by saying that those people who are acting in the name of that God didn't get their religion right. So there are Muslim scholars who say that violent jihad or honor killings are actually inconsistent with the teachings of the Holy Quran, that they don't understand what the Quran really teaches. They don't really understand what Allah wants from us. Christian apologists have defended Christianity's record in the Crusades by saying that the Crusades are not an authentically Christian movement, but they are a perversion of the Christian gospel. So maybe the people who were involved in the Crusades or the people who are involved in violent Islamic terrorism have misunderstood what their faiths are all about. If that's true, why should we count those instances as harms that are to the detriment of religion? So maybe we shouldn't answer yes to this question. Maybe we should answer no, but then we face this question. How do we distinguish the real Athenism from false or inauthentic Athenism? That's going to be really hard work of interpretation. And since very few of us belong to many more than one religion, that means that we're going to be having to analyze religions that we're not really very well versed in. What gives us the standing to criticize someone else's interpretation of their own faith. And yet it seems clear that there will be different interpretations. If you think about a religion like Christianity, that's the one I'm the most familiar with, there's a whole bunch of doctrines, a whole bunch of practices that the average parishioner has only a weak grasp on. So it's understandable that there could be some mistakes that come into people's understanding of what their religion is all about and what it requires. So back to our question one sub-questions. We have just a couple of more. How can religion cause anything? Does it make sense to say that religion is actually causing harms to come about? I think you can draw a comparison to the Prohibition movement. The Prohibitionists were criticizing the demon rum, and they were very successful. They got the United States to outlaw alcohol consumption and production. But rhetorically, they required on demonizing not necessarily drinkers, but rum or alcohol of various kinds, right? But can alcohol really cause things? Well, there's a role for alcohol to play in, say, drunk driving, but alcohol is just a chemical compound, like water, right? Or oxygen, or air, I guess. In what sense is alcohol actually causing drunk driving? To say that it causes drunk driving factors out all sorts of other causal influences, or at least influences that go into a cause of something as destructive as drunk driving. So we would need to get clear on what religion is doing to cause things, and religion can be implicated in a number of ways. It can have explicit commands, or it can explicitly forbid things, but it can also just hold up certain things as valuable, or it can mark insiders from outsiders. It can mandate social structures that affect people in various ways, all kinds of ways that religion can possibly be implicated. Here's another case, the Matthew case. Matthew is a fundamentalist Protestant, and he belongs to a sect that forbids money lending and investment. So they read Jesus' words who said, when Jesus said, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. They took that literally, and so they thought, all right, no money lending, no investment, just rummage through your couch cushions for pocket change, and that's what you have to live on and live by faith. Okay, so suppose he belongs to that sect. Suppose also that Stephen's religion allows money lending and investment, so he and his people have cornered the market and prospered. Okay? Stephen has a different religion, and he happens to benefit from Matthew's very strict reading of that gospel verse. So the result is this. Matthew resents Stephen for his wealth. In the absence of his religion, he would not resent Stephen. In the absence of his religion, he would not resent Stephen. So, in the Matthew case, is religion causing resentment towards Stephen? And in what sense? To what extent is his religion culpable for its contribution to the animosity that Matthew feels toward his neighbor, Stephen? And yet another, I guess this is a sub question, but what are the ramifications for Matthew's culpability? In other words, if we assign some blame to Matthew's Protestant fundamentalist sect, do we therefore have to excuse Matthew? Or does Matthew have his own kind of culpability? And if he does, are we double counting? Are we blaming both his religion and Matthew for the harm of the resentment and animosity that Matthew is expressing towards his neighbor Stephen? Think about this guy, Torquemada. If we want to say that Catholicism is responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, or Christianity is responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, does that mean that Torquemada was just a helpless pawn, pushed about by these social forces that he didn't understand and had no hope of controlling? Or is Torquemada responsible for being implicated in the Spanish Inquisition? Okay, so much for question one. What are we going to evaluate? The waters are already pretty muddy, but I'm going to make them muddier still. What are the benefits and harms? There's all sorts of benefits and harms that we could think about in connection with religion. I'm going to start with the most controversial. So my first sub-question is this. What about salvific goods? What about salvific goods? What do I mean by this? It's a term that I just basically invented again, but what I mean is what Christians would refer to as salvation or grace. Other religions might offer nirvana or the hope for a desirable reincarnation, an afterlife in Valhalla or Elysium if you're a noble warrior who dies in battle. But the idea is that many religions offer goods that are spiritual and not temporal. Should we consider those? If the religion actually brings those goods about, makes them possible, those are going to be some pretty weighty goods. They're going to be very, very valuable goods if these religions are to be trusted in their description of these goods. And then this leads to a similar and related sub-question. Can people enjoy these salvific goods for eternity? If they can, they get an eternal enjoyment of a really great good. So the upshot is this. If a single religion is true, and it offers even a single salvific good for only a few people, the benefit of religion may still vastly outweigh all harms. If we count salvific goods, especially if we count them for an eternity, even for a few people, that could potentially swamp all the disvalue from all the harm, all the strife, all the bad stuff that we might want to attribute to religion. And interestingly, if a single religion is true, even some of the false religions could have benefits that are salvific, right? If religion A is true, and I believe religion B, but religion B is kind of similar to religion A, and so ultimately it leads me to consider and finally accept religion A. There's kind of even a derivative benefit in religion B if a single religion is true and if it offers salvific goods. Now, most of the people, in fact, I think everybody who's offered the consequential critique against religion do not want to count salvific goods because they think that all religions are false. Why should we count things that are imaginary, like grace or nirvana? But in the philosophy of religion, it's still an open question whether any religion is true. No one has proven that all religions are false. There's still quite a lot of debate about many of the major religions, at least the major conceptions of God. So it's okay if we want to exclude salvific goods from our analysis, but that means that the conclusion is going to come with a really big asterisk. And that asterisk is assuming that none of these religions is true, which we don't know. So those are the sub-questions for question 2. We'll get another one here. What about ordinary benefits and harms? Temporal benefits and harms. Again, lots of things that we could lump under this category, and it's clear that religion has been implicated in things that are harmful and bad. It's also been implicated in things that are beneficial and good. I think what we'll find, though, is that in many cases, religion is implicated in both harms and goods concerning the same thing. So consider science. I think science is good. I think it's a great good. There are clear cases in which religion has worked against the advancement of science. There is the trial of Galileo, when Galileo's teachings were found to, or his science was found to contradict the teachings of the church, and so they tried to put the kibosh on him. I'll count that as a harm. There is American fundamentalist opposition to the teaching of biological evolution. Let's count that as a harm as well. At the same time, though, before we say, all right, religion has harmed science, we have to recognize that religion has actually promoted science as well. So even as Galileo was being suppressed by the church was actually fostering scientific research. They were sponsoring scientific research, and it continues to do so today. Isaac Newton, one of the seminal figures in the scientific revolution, was deeply moved by his Christian faith. So what we're going to find then in thinking about ordinary benefits and harms is that religion is sort of a mixed bag. It brings some benefits and some harms. How are we going to make sense of that? How are we going to analyze that for purposes of figuring out whether we'd be better off without religion or not? Okay, third major question. How do we compare the benefits and harms? How do we compare all the benefits and harms? Let's say we get a complete list, or maybe it's a book. How are we going to work through that and weigh them? And here's where things get rather hairy. The first question is, are they commensurable, and how? Are they commensurable, and how? So this touches on an issue in value theory called value pluralism. Value pluralists hold that there are at least two values, things that are good. Let's call them A and B. And value pluralists say that this relationship obtains for A and B. First of all, A is not greater than B, A is not less than B, and A and B are not equal. A is not greater than B, A is not less than B, and A and B are not equal. Now, if you're thinking of numbers, whole numbers, something looks wrong about this to you, right? For any two whole numbers, we can say that one is greater than the other, or at least they're equal. If you're a value monist, you think that that's also true of all goods. So hedonism is an example of value monism. Hedonism says that basically all the good things in the world are just variations of pleasure. There's only ultimately one kind of good, and that is pleasure, and we can understand the value of different things in terms of how much pleasure they constitute or produce. Pluralists deny this. Pluralists say that there are some values that can't be compared in that way. So let me give you some examples. Let's take an abstract good like beauty. This picture may not look all that beautiful as it's been cropped and photoshopped by me to fit it into this frame, but let's just say that this stands for a beautiful sunset. You've all seen a beautiful sunset. You've had this, maybe a gasp of ecstatic awe when you witness this beautiful event. So let's say that we're going to compare beauty, which is a good, to another kind of good, friendship. I think friendship is a good. Even kitten friendship counts as friendship, right? That's a good thing. But does it make sense to say of beauty and friendship that beauty is a greater good than friendship? Or does it make sense to say that beauty is an inferior good to friendship? Or does it make sense to say that beauty is equally as valuable as friendship? To me, none of those statements make sense. To me, and as you can tell, I'm drawn to value pluralism. To me, it just makes sense to say that beauty is good and friendship is good. But there is no common metric that allows us to compare them one with the other. In fact, if there were, then it seems like we'd be able to say something like this. Well, 2 friendships would be worth 8 sunsets. So, if you're low on friendship, just go look at a bunch of sunsets and you'll come out okay. No, that doesn't make sense to me. I think friendship is good, and I think sunsets and beauty are good. I want both in my life, but there's no conversion chart that says how much each is worth in terms of the other. Okay, well, what does it have to do with religion? Well, think of a religious example. The music of Johann Sebastian Bach. It is sublimely beautiful. It is one of the great achievements in human civilization, and it was made possible by religion. In this case, Protestant Christianity. Bach was a deeply pious Christian. It animated his love of music. He was hired as a a choir master, so religion not only motivated him, it actually provided the financial means for him to pursue his vocation. I take that as a good thing. I take the music of Bach as a genuine good. Okay, well, let's think about a religious bad. Here's a picture of the Spanish Reconquista, which involved the persecution of Jews and Muslims. Some were killed, some were run out of town, some were forced to violate their conscience and convert to Catholicism when they really didn't want to. I'm just going to call that a bad, right? I think that's a harm. Does it make sense to say that the music of Bach is a greater good than the badness of the persecution and the Reconquista? Does it make sense to say that the music of Bach is less good than the badness of the harm in the Reconquista, or that these things are about equal? To me, that doesn't make sense. To me, Bach's music is good, and the persecution of people during the Reconquista is bad, but there is no common metric that lets us say that one is greater than the other. It doesn't make sense to say, had Bach written just a few more oratorios, that would have made it okay to expel people from that Spanish village, right? These things are incommensurable. Now, you might say, if you're motivated by a strong sense of civil rights, which is good for you, you might say that, no, Bach's music is not going to offset the harm that came to those people in Spain during the Reconquista. And maybe you're right about that. I'm inclined to agree with you are. But it doesn't yet make sense to me to say that any amount of aesthetic beauty whatsoever is going to be outweighed by any amount of suffering whatsoever. Right? Any amount of suffering, no matter how trivial and fleeting, does that always outweigh any amount of aesthetic greatness, no matter how profound or moving? I'm not ready to accept that. To me, it seems like suffering and beauty both have, in one case, disvalue, and in the other case, value. But there is no way of commensurating them. There's no way of setting them off against one another or comparing them. So that's the problem of comparison of commensurable goods. How do we do it? Maybe we can't do it. The literature about value pluralism suggests that there is no way of rationally comparing incommensurable goods, at least no way that we've found yet. So maybe we're not able to make the comparisons that are necessary to make the consequential critique. A similar question is this: how do we compare goods and harms across persons? Those of you who have studied utilitarianism with me or maybe with Walter or somebody else, maybe you've encountered the problem of utility comparisons. So utilitarianism says we should do whatever promotes the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, which sounds great until you actually try to apply it. So think of it this way. Suppose Alice and Joe want to go out to eat, and they want to go out to eat together, so they have to go to the same restaurant. Alice wants French food, Joe wants Mexican. How can we tell that if they go to a French place, the unhappiness that Joe gets is going to be offset by the happiness that Alice gets, or vice versa if they go to Mexican food? There's no way to do that. There's no way to look inside somebody's mind and say, aha, you're experiencing 97 units of utility, and I would get 98 if we went to Joe's Crab Shack, so we're going to go to Joe's Crab Shack in the name of utility. There's no way to compare utility outcomes across persons, at least no easy way that anybody has come up with. When we're talking about religion, we're talking about billions of human beings who have been affected by religion in all kinds of different ways. How are we going to compare their relationship with religion? How are we going to compare the effects of religion on all these people in a way that's not arbitrary or ad hoc? Next question, what are the relevant counterfactuals, which is philosophy talk for what would have happened in the absence of this particular condition? Or what will happen in the future if we don't do this? Counterfactuals. So here are a couple more cases. Consider the case of Sven. Sven, like a good bloodthirsty Viking, decides to persecute somebody. So he persecutes Knut in the name of Odin. He's a strict Odinist, and so he goes and persecutes Knut. In the absence of his religious beliefs, Sven would still persecute Knut, and just as severely. Okay, this is a case where religion is implicated in a harm. He's harming Knut in the name of Odin. That's bad. And yet it's also the case that religion is not producing any more harm than what would have otherwise occurred. In the absence of his religious belief, he would still persecute Knut. Maybe he's using religion as a rationalization. Maybe he just doesn't like Knut. Maybe he would be motivated by some other factor. When I was doing my research for the paper that I've based this talk on, I read a book by a sociologist named Phil Zuckerman, who wrote a book called Society Without God, I believe. He spent a few years in Scandinavia and wanted to study it. He's an atheist. He wanted to study it as the closest approximation we could get to a society that was completely a-religious. And he thought that it was pretty good there. But he interviewed a young man who grew up as a Christian, a practicing Christian. He was still a practicing Christian, I believe. And so he was in the minority. This was in Sweden. And he said that he was bullied and tormented his whole childhood. He had to change schools multiple times. And as he related this story to the researcher, Phil Zuckerman, he began to tear up. So he still is bearing emotional scars from being teased for being religious, teased by his atheist colleagues. Well, maybe 200 years ago, those schoolmates would have been teasing somebody else for some other reason, or maybe they would have been teasing this guy for being too short or for being too blonde or something like that. Maybe they still would have persecuted him. But in the Sven cases, religion is not contributing more harm than otherwise would have happened. So we need to get clear on how many Sven cases there are and how to score them in doing our consequential analysis of religion. Here's a slightly different case, the case of Rajiv. Rajiv persecutes Ahmed in the name of Shiva. And in the absence of his belief in Shiva, he would persecute Ahmed even more severely. So his Shivism gives him license to persecute his enemies, maybe even encourages him to persecute his enemies in various contexts. And yet it also puts a constraint. It says you may persecute your enemy, but don't kill him. So if he was not a Shivist, then maybe he would actually kill his enemy. So in this case, in the Rajiv case, and cases like it, religion is implicated in the harm, but it's also producing less harm than otherwise would have happened. Those are counterfactuals. The Sven case and the Rajiv case are counterfactuals. The last sub-question I want to talk about, what are the trends? What are the trends in how religion generates benefits and harms? Let's compare religion to something else, not politics this time, but medicine. Think about medicine. Medicine has been practiced for millennia. But really, it's only rather recently that it's really sort of come into its own. For most of the history of medicine, for most conditions, you're probably better off not going to the doctor. You're probably better off just toughing it out and hoping it gets better on its own. Otherwise, you were going to get a good bleeding. And if that bleeding didn't work, then they would give you an extra bleeding, right? And then they would start cutting off your limbs. So you might as well just tough it out at home, read the paper or something. Thankfully, we didn't, 500 years ago, imagine a world without medicine and try to make that world come about. We stuck at it, and medicine, in the past 100, 150 years, began making great strides, and now we take lots of things for granted that are unimaginable to people a couple hundred years ago in terms of medical care and medical technologies and medical outcomes. Might we see the same thing with religion? Might we see that For many, many, many centuries, religion has been involved in many destructive ways. But now religion is kind of coming into its own, and it's being changed, and we're sort of getting a clearer idea of what the religion is all about, and can actually be a force for good in the world. We might be cutting ourselves off from a source of positive change in the world. So that's what I mean by trends, thinking about not just what's happened in the past, but what might we project in the future in terms of religion's involvement with benefits and harms. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of questions, and I haven't given you any answers to them, at least not many of them. But I think that any consequential critique of religion is going to have to answer them. It's going to have to make some kind of determination of these things. So I think that the best that a critic of religion can hope for, someone who wanted to make the consequential critique of religion, is something like this. If we charge religion with 20% of the blame in Melita's cases, and half the blame in Matthew cases, and if there are no Sven cases, and if we count Rajiv cases as suboptimal, and if the total amount of Melita's, Matthew, Sven, Rajiv cases is no more than 10% of the total set of religiously inspired harm, and if we exclude divine grace as a benefit, and if we count religion as a single category, and if blah, 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 et cetera, then the world would be better off without religion. Now, as you can tell, this is not going to fit on a bumper sticker very well. It won't even fit on a t-shirt, right? It does have the advantage of greater accuracy, but you can't easily type this into a blog post and hit send and think that you've settled the argument once and for all. This is a conditional clause. It's an if-then clause, and just notice all the ifs there. I even left some out because I got tired of writing if so much. There's a whole bunch of ifs there. So this conclusion struggles under the weight of all these antecedent conditions, all these suppositions, these assumptions. And I think that weakens the argument. So I think at most, we should admit that it's not obviously true that the world would be better off without religion. We can't take it as just painfully obvious to all right-thinking people that we should get rid of religion, or that religion has been a force for harm in the world. It's much, much more complicated than that. And if you hear people making this kind of claim, religion is the most destructive force known to man, imagine a world with no religion, then remember this. Remember how much they are assuming about the background conditions and value judgments that they are making just to answer some of these questions. Okay, I conclude with some disclaimers and caveats, and these will be brief. First of all, the problem that I've tried to diagnose is not the fact that the consequential critique, bless you, needs assumptions. Assumptions are fine. That's a religious benefit right there. Add that to the ledger. The problem is not that they have to use assumptions. Assumptions are unavoidable in philosophy and science and history and all kinds of areas of inquiry. The problem, rather, is that there's so many assumptions, and the assumptions are either unknowable, or they're very, very contestable, or they involve value judgments, and that people just frankly haven't done the work to figure out what the truth is about them. Similarly, proponents and opponents may agree on many assumptions. I agree that we should count it as a harm when someone kills another human being in the name of their God. Right? I'll just call that a harm. There are going to be some that we disagree on as well, right? Like salvific goods. But I don't mean to imply that all of these assumptions are going to be completely divisive between believers and non-believers. I also think that there are answers out there. I don't mean to imply that there's no way we can ever know any of these things. Some of them may be unknowable in principle, but some of them are just unknown at present. We just need to do a lot more empirical study, a lot more legwork. And keep in mind that many of my comments tonight will apply to defenses of religion as well. I've focused on criticisms of religion, but sometimes people defend religion by pointing out the ways that it has benefited society, and sometimes religious political conservatives say that we need to protect religion in various ways, and if we become an irreligious, godless society, our civilization or our society will crumble from within or face external pressures without. So I think a lot of what I had to say, maybe all of it, will apply to defenses of religion as well. So with that, I will say thank you and ask if there are any questions. Thank you. And how are we doing? How are we doing Q&A?
I think that we should ask if there are questions from students first, because faculty tend to want to ask questions.
Ben?
In the case of, was it Andrew and Matthew, the two?
Matthew and Stephen?
Yes, them. In that case, why, I'm forgetting, Stephen was the religious one, right?
Well, they're both religious. Matthew's religion prevented him or forbade him from saving money and investing it.
Yes, but then why in that case would he only be resentful towards Matthew if Andrew?
Stephen.
Whichever one the other guy is, why would he be resentful towards him if only if his religion makes him so? Wouldn't he be resentful anyway since he's wealthier than him?
He might be, but the way I was describing or trying to describe that scenario is that the gap in their wealth was in part attributable to Matthew's religious belief. So maybe in another scenario, he would have resented Matthew. If they both had the same religion, but Stephen was rich and Matthew was poor, then he might still resent Stephen. But in this case, he's looking down on Stephen, and his religion is prompting that. So just to lay my cards on the table, and some of the historians can maybe fill in the details a little bit more, but in the history of Europe, Jews had different laws about money lending, and that advantaged them in various ways, but it also exposed them to resentment and pressure in various ways from their Christian society. So should we count that against Christianity, against Judaism? I was kind of in all my cases, I was trying to use a recognizable religion, but not an actual religion. But that was the kind of case that I had in mind. Elise?
Your argument with religion being harmful or having harm, would it be advent of one of the wars where you said that he would have killed these people the same severely without religion? And at the end you said that you believe that if someone were to kill someone in the name of God, you would think that is harmful to religion. But I just don't understand how you can put those two together and say that if you take away the religious part, you can still severely hurt someone without religion. How, in the name of God, how those two connect?
So I think you're talking about the Sven case.
Yeah.
So Sven persecutes Knut. Maybe it's not too far back. This one? Sven persecutes Knut in the name of Odin. In the absence of his religious beliefs, Sven would still persecute Knut, and just as severely.
On religion, that would have done the same thing without religion. Because then one would persecute him if he was just a religious man, so he said he did it for God. But
Mhm.
God only wanted to do it.
In this case, I didn't even assume that Odin doesn't want Sven to persecute Knut, or I don't believe in Odin, but if we thought of Odinism as an actual religion, we could just suppose that Odinism does encourage this sort of thing, perhaps. All I'm saying in this case is that there is a harm, persecution of a non-believer, or persecution of another person, maybe the believer, and it is implicated in the person's religious belief, the persecutor's religious belief. But it's not, at the same time, in this case, we're not seeing any more harm than we otherwise would have seen. So you can still say that it's a harm, but in comparison with the counterfactual, the alternate scenario where there is no religious influence, maybe we'd still see the same outcome. Maybe we'd still see Sven persecuting Knut. So maybe we're going to see this harm either way. It just so happens that in our world, it took a religious pathway. In an alternative universe where that religion was absent, it would still occur just through a different pathway. Am I answering your question? Okay. All right. Dan?
In your first remarks, you mentioned mediocrity. What would be the case if we mentioned that we cannot not have an ideology? How would that run in this? How would we define religion in this case? Everybody's got an ideology, only some of them are customarily called religion.
I guess I would need to know what you mean by ideology, because that term is used in a whole bunch of different ways. If you mean something like a worldview, everybody has a worldview, pretty much. So then the question is, how would that affect our analysis of religion?
It would look like then, what we're calling religion is only customarily called religion. They're all worldly. Some of which are called religion, some of which are not.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to do the consequential. In other words, you're broadening out the picture a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you're right that we can't not have an ideology or a worldview, then it's sort of a fool's errand to imagine a world without them. Maybe not quite as hard as imagining a world with four-sided triangles, but something like that. Maybe so. I do not have a definition of religion, nor do I have a definition of ideology. I don't have necessary and sufficient criteria for categorizing anything in this way or the other. So that may just make the analysis all that much harder. I'm open to that.
Assuming, based on what you said, on what you presented, if I base my thinking on what you just presented, I would conclude that the new atheists have overreached themselves in attributing significant harm to religion, to the existence or practice of religion. That's what I would conclude from what you have presented. So do you think the new atheists would be on firmer ground if they merely claim that religion is overrated?
They might. That would be more defensible, I think. But it would still run into some of these questions. On what basis are you deciding that it's been overrated? What are the standards? What are the instances you're going to look at to assess its performance in terms of what it's supposed to deliver and what it actually delivers?
I think if they base their assumption on, if they assume that religion was rated highly, culturally in general, historically in general, legally in general, that it has been rated highly, then they could go from there, based on what you presented, and claim that religion was overrated.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
So if in a
just the first impression.
right, so in a soberer moment, they might say, okay, well, we can't really show that the world would be better off without religion. But maybe we can show that we'd be better off if we didn't focus on it so much, or that we didn't give them particular privileges and exemptions politically, or something like that.
They should be more modest in their assessments, not be such blowhards.
They could, but that wouldn't sell books like hotcakes, I think. So, the inflammatory books are the ones that sell. I think that's part of it. I don't mean to imply that they're just making this up and pretending, but that kind of more circumspect conclusion isn't sexy, even if it's true. Mark.
Just talk a bit more about the book. It's not just I'm looking for causality, right? Change in causality. And just in your own mind, that question, is religion causing anything? Right? I mean, to me, that's a really interesting question from the discussion. Can you just talk a bit more about that?
I'm not sure that I can make sense of the claim that religion causes anything. Maybe belief in religion causes things, but that's a little bit different. But usually when I see criticisms of religion as causing such and such, or even defenses of religion as causing such and such, they're papering over a lot of more complicated phenomena. So I gave the example of alcohol and prohibition. I mean, alcohol is not causing people to, streak across campus and then dance on a table with a lampshade on their head. Now, they might not do that in the absence of alcohol. Maybe they would, who knows, right? But the point is, it's simplistic. It's overly simplistic to say that alcohol causes people to do stupid things. Stupidity causes people to do stupid things, right? Now, alcohol may enhance one's sense of stupidity. And I don't mean to imply that dancing with a lampshade on your head is stupid, but if people are into that. I don't mean to offend you. I respect your life choice. But the point is, it's too simplistic, right, to say that there's a causal relationship between this and that. If this is religion and that is some complicated socio-historical conflict, right? I don't want to say that religion has nothing to do with it, but I'd probably turn to the social sciences to say, how do we talk meaningfully about what religion does? To answer that question, we probably need to figure out what a religion is, right? Or at least stipulate for the purpose of discussion. Yuhan?
Are you able to frame any answerable questions in this area?
Am I able to frame any answerable questions in this area? What area do you mean?
That could be answered.
We ask the questions, you guys do the answering. I don't know that I can on sort of a macro level. I'd be more confident about particular levels, but my guess is what we would have to do is just to look at individual people and ask them, how has your life been impacted by this particular way of life, this particular practice, this particular belief system. So I don't know that I can't think of any good questions that we could formulate that's going to get at what these people are after. Now, the social sciences study religion all the time. So we could come up with a study that considers the relationship between, say, a society's like maybe tracing the different religious attitudes toward learning and technological development, right? There's probably been some studies on that. There have been interesting studies on self-reported levels of happiness from religious people. Religious people tend to report higher levels of happiness. So we can do some more fine-grained questions like that. But even then, they're going to be very fine-grained, and the conclusions are going to be kind of tenuous. They may run into some of the counterfactual issues that I've raised here. Does that answer your question about me asking your question?
You're saying that yes, but they would have to get more almost like data-driven and almost individual person rather than broad.
Well, if we're thinking about kind of an ultimate judgment about whether religion makes us better off or not, that's probably going to have to be done on an individual level. On a social level, we can look at particular dimensions of social well-being, right? We can look for evidence that religious commitment is correlated negatively or positively with affluence, right? Do religious societies tend to see more economic growth or less economic growth? And that might be interesting. In economics, the conclusions are always kind of provisional and contestable. So I don't know how far we're going to be able to get with that. But I mean, I looked at a lot of social scientific research when I was working on this project, and there's some interesting data out there. It's not my area of expertise, but I know that it's out there, and it seems meaningful. It seems like it's not just making stuff up or pseudoscientific. Becca? Oh, you're asking me if I believe that people live for eternity and enjoy infinite goods. I do. Because I think it's true. So some of my students know this. Maybe I've said it in our class. I don't know. But I'm a practicing Christian. I believe the Christian gospel. I'm locating myself in that tradition. And that tradition, I think, speaks fairly equivocally that human beings are created for eternity. They're created to enjoy the infinite goods of love of God, love with God, communion with God for eternity. That is our intended destiny. What that means is another question. What it means to live eternally, what it might be like to live eternally. I will leave that to the theologians. But as far as my personal belief, I do believe that. Mhm.
So if there's no religion, do the new atheists have an alternative religion? Because there's bound to be something else that comes around similar.
What would we be swapping religion out for? Yeah. My guess is most of them would say something like reason. Maybe they would say science, or maybe they would say, you may remember I had 3 book covers on that screen. The one on the left is Sam Harris. Harris is, I think it's fair to say he's a utilitarian. I think I saw him identify himself that way. So, Harris would say we would just, look for ways to create more pleasure in the world, more happiness in the world. We devote ourselves to making ourselves happy, and we'd be able to do that better if we get rid of religion, because religion makes people unhappy. Or they might say, well, we'll just let people decide for themselves what to substitute for religion. Right? There's some people who think that we need a kind of people who are not themselves religious, but think that we're going to need something kind of like religion to fill in the gap, because people like certain aspects of it, even if they find themselves not really believing it. And there have been attempts to come up with something, but it's probably just going to depend on the person. That's an interesting question, though. Sarah?
Well, I just want to say I think this conversation is really interesting, and that would be totally different if we didn't have separation of church and state, or if we didn't have freedom of religion at all. So I just think that's interesting to think about. But my question for you is, if an atheist doesn't believe in the existence of religion at all, can they even justify if the world is better off without religion because they don't believe in its existence in the first place?
Well, I guess if it doesn't exist, then it can't have an effect on the world. But why would an atheist not believe in the existence of religion?
Well, I guess maybe I'm confused on the definition of what it means. Because to me, it's just like, how can you say that it would be better off if you don't believe that it exists at all?
Oh, well, I mean, so an atheist is simply someone who doesn't believe that there is a God. And Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and others just say straight up, there is no God. God is just a figment of our imagination. But what exasperates them is that so many people do believe in God and practice their faith and contribute to religious organizations and proselytize, try to evangelize people. And that's what they want us to move beyond. So they think it's true that there is no God. Dawkins gives a bunch of arguments against the existence of God in his book. I'm not sure about Harris. I think he does. But what they really want to do is not only get people to stop believing in God, but get people to stop practicing religion. Garrett?
Now, since our Western culture is basically founded on the old traditions of the Judeo-Christian tradition, how would we decide what's wrong and what's not? If there was no religion, if there never was.
How would we know what's morally right and morally wrong if there was no religion? Well, that's an argument that a lot of defenders of religion make, that religion gives us a kind of moral framework. And outside of that moral framework, we would not have any consensus about right and wrong. There are versions of this argument that are more simplistic. There are versions of this argument that are quite interesting and sophisticated. I think the new atheists would say that we don't need religion to tell us what is right and wrong because we have reason, as I was saying to Akosua. We've got reason. We can just think it through. In fact, Sam Harris, I sat in this room a few years ago and watched a TED Talk by Sam Harris. And that's essentially what he said. We can just think about what's good for people and what's bad for people. We can say that Islamic terrorism is bad. We can say that, giving jobless benefits to unemployed workers is good. And so on the New Atheists, they want to say that we can just use reason. Now, there's a kind of optimism there that reason is all going to lead us to the same page. And as you're discovering in my philosophy class, it doesn't always work that way, right? Philosophers are always disagreeing with one another. What happens if we disagree? Simply using reason to think about what is right and what is wrong. Then where do we turn? Mike?
Christopher Hitchens spent most of his intellectual life saying there was no God, but by now he must know the truth of that. But do you think he discovered it? What were the consequences of it?
That's not for me to speculate. Maybe I'll ask him one day. Walter?
I was going to ask a related question. How about this scenario? What if one of the new atheists actually had a religious conversion and he started believing in God, but he still believed, was convinced of all the harm that organized religions caused? How do you think that might go down?
Well, I actually touch on this possibility briefly in my paper. Sometimes critics of religion make the kind of arguments that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And as I said, the common response is to say, "Nuh-uh, communism was worse." Gotcha. But a better response is to say, well, regardless of the harms and benefits that it produces, that's not a reason to think that it's false, right? It's not a reason to disbelieve in religion. And maybe that's true. But still, even if, at least logically speaking, it's possible that religion is true, and yet we'd be better off not believing it, right? Depending on the content, that might not be actually the case. But it's possible that religion is so bad that even if it's true, we'd be better off not believing it. So maybe your atheist would arrive at that. Maybe the atheist, it would probably have to go something like this. Maybe the atheist thinks there is a supreme being, but he's a supreme being as the deists conceived of him. In other words, he's created the universe and then he's just sort of taken his hands off the whole thing and stepped back. We don't have any personal relationship. He doesn't really care anything about us. So some philosophers think that we can prove on the basis of reason that there is some necessary being outside of the cosmos, the cause of the cosmos, something like that. So maybe an atheist would change and ultimately become a theist in that sense, but still think that all attempts to sort of praise that being and worship that being and serve that being have just been disastrous failures, and so he wouldn't endorse any particular religion. That's possible. I don't know if that's ever really happened. Maybe Antony Flew, who apparently had a conversion from atheism to theism. He's a famous atheistic philosopher, died not too long ago. But he didn't embrace any particular religion, and that may have been part of his reasoning.